Hello, this is Dwight Mutonono, also known as Mnyaradzi, also known as Mutos, and welcome to the Connection Death. We're now in Acts chapter 27, and we're coming towards the end of the book now, and we are talking about the journey to Rome. Paul sails to Rome after he had appealed to Caesar, and Agrippa and Festus came to the conclusion that this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. So they then send him off to Rome, and we're going to kick it off from chapter 27 at the beginning of the trip. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." That's from verses 1 through to 10 that I've just read. Now, storms and shipwrecks, these were a common occurrence in the area that we are talking about here, the Mediterranean Sea, and traveling by ship was relatively dangerous during those days. And Paul had experienced 3 shipwrecks during his travels. This is 2 Corinthians 11:25. He mentions 3 shipwrecks that he experienced. And some scholars say that as many as 1 in 5 ships faced weather threats on their journeys. This is in the Mediterranean area. And God had said through an angel that Paul would go to Rome. So before this whole incident in Acts 23 verse 11, an angel had appeared to Paul and told him he would go to Rome. And we will see later on in this chapter, chapter 27 verse 24, that there was another angelic visit to confirm, to reassure him that he would go to Rome and stand trial before Caesar. So it's important to understand, the whole way that Luke is presenting this story. Because firstly, there's a human vindication where Paul is a prisoner, yes, but even though he is a prisoner, his credibility remains. His credibility as a leader was at stake, because people would be asking questions about how is it that a Christian leader, a leader of the way, is being imprisoned, and he needed to give a case or to present his story so that the audience, Christianity, would not lose credibility. So followers of the way would be wondering about him as a legitimate leader. And his detractors would see this as proof that God was not involved in what Paul was doing. So they could actually say, hey, look at this. How can God allow his leader to be imprisoned and all that sort of thing? And what we do see, and what Luke is at pains to make us see, is that Paul had been vindicated before Agrippa and the high-ranking officials. He could have been set free, and the thing that actually caused him to go to Rome was his perception and his understanding that God did not want him to be released and within Judea, because he would be in danger in that area, and he needed to go to Rome. So before Agrippa and the high-ranking officials, he had been vindicated. They had cleared him. They had said that he had done nothing wrong, and he was then sent to Rome because he had appealed to Rome. Because of it was almost like he was seeking asylum from Rome. That's what he did. And then there's a divine vindication, which we will see as we continue with chapter 27. Up to this point, it was persecution and division that had threatened the advance of the gospel. But now, there were natural obstacles. The weather was against them. And Luke provides detailed information of the journey in this chapter. So we see him giving us all this detail. It's not clear why he gives so much detail. Of course, one of the things is that he actually was there. But what it does do is that it gives a good authentication of the information that he provides, because it proves accurate. When you then look at the details of what he said, it really lines up with what would have happened in that first century environment, and in the Mediterranean Sea and the ships and so forth. Amidst the storm, we find that Paul is vindicated, and God will not allow him to die, even by natural causes. Because of Paul, he would also preserve the lives of all on board the ship. Another thing that we do see here is that there was special favor that Paul was given. The centurion Julius allowed Paul and his companions, Aristarchus is one of the people. Luke, of course, is mentioned. He's not mentioned by name, but he talks about we. And, it's a we section. It means that he was part of the team that actually traveled with Paul. So this was probably because Paul was a Roman citizen. They expected him to be exonerated, and the trial was therefore just a mere formality. So this is why it would seem that Paul, in going to Rome, would receive special favor, and it would seem that he was treated differently to most prisoners. And so when they went ashore in Sidon, for example, Julius the centurion allowed Paul to go out of custody, meet with the disciples, and just fellowship with them so that they might provide for his needs. One of the things that would happen on the ship is that the centurion would be responsible for the needs of all the people that were part of his consignment, the people that he was going with. But then the provisions would be limited. So it was always welcome if there was somebody amongst the group who could actually get extra provisions for themselves and look after themselves, be independent of the centurion's provisions. And this is what happened with Paul. He was able to get his own provisions from the saints in Sidon. And that's what's happening at this point. And just as we want to close off this section, it's important to understand the dynamics of what was happening here, because what was happening is they were on what they called an Alexandrian grain ship. Egypt provided about 1/3 of the 200 to 400,000 tons of wheat that Rome needed annually. So Rome needed about 200 to 400,000 tons of wheat annually. And most of this, or maybe not most of it, but 1/3 of it was coming from Alexandria or from Egypt. And the Alexandrian ships would be carrying a lot of that. And the winds over the Mediterranean going southward, going from Rome to Alexandria, would be quicker and incident-free because of the direction of the wind. But the prevailing wind directions in the opposite direction, going from Alexandria to Rome, would make it a 3 times longer trip generally. And then also, as we approached winter, there will be all kinds of storms that would happen over the sea, and it would be hazardous to travel during the winter. So they could carry several passengers, and in this instance, there were 276 passengers on the ship. And this trip, it started off, more or less close to the winter time. But then as they were getting further and further, Paul realized that they were now into the period that was most dangerous to travel. And he actually advised them not to continue with the journey and maybe to stop until the weather conditions would improve, which would mean a few months maybe waiting in a particular part of the Mediterranean or on a particular, they would have to dock somewhere, and they would maybe spend some time on a particular landmass until they are ready to go on, and the weather would have been better for them to travel. The conditions would have been better for them to travel. So we'll stop at this point, and we'll continue in the next session to look at what actually does happen, because Paul warns them, but they choose not to heed his warning. And we'll talk about why they didn't heed his warning, and we'll also understand what happened and how the storm eventually caused them to have a shipwreck. You're blessed. Continue in God.